Hey there, welcome back to the channel. So this is a project to build a shelf out of this cedar board. And so while I was at the lumber yard getting project wood, I saw this board and I just really liked it, the way that the colors looked, and it had this void that was kind of, gnarly looking, and I figured it would look for like a really cool epoxy shelf. And so I picked up this piece. It was a long board. It was like 6 feet long, but I cut down just a section that was really bad and to use for this project. And so what you see me doing now is just taking the chisel and we're removing the void and all the, kind of rotted bad pieces. And um, so this project kind of spawned off of another project I was working on, which was I showed it on the channel a while ago. And it was that the cedar lazy Susan that I built, and so that one was using some smaller pieces, about 4 inch wide pieces, and this is a much wider, like 8 inch piece. But that's why I was at the lumberyard, was to get cedar for that, and then I saw a few of these nice 8 inch piece boards, and I wanted to get some of those for future projects. And so while I was there, I picked up some extra, and this was one of them. And so we'll do a voiceover for this video, see how it does, see how I like doing it this way. Um, and so here you see I'm taking it on the jointer. We're just going to get the bottoms smooth enough to start working with this. And so as you see there, it's mostly smooth. It's there's a couple small areas that weren't perfect, but it's going to be good enough moving forward. And then this is the opposite side, and we're just going to clean that up a little bit, the side with the voids. And there you go, looking better. So there's actually 3 voids. There's the large one on the top that you see, and there's one there and one here. And so this is going to be good enough to get us moving forward. And so once I get through just cleaning this up, I'm going to take it on a table saw and we're going to trim it down to make sure that it's square. The other side, the other edge was already done on the jointer, so it was squared up, and now this side is squared up. And now we're just cutting it down to length, getting the ends all nice. And the saw wouldn't quite reach all the way, so I just took my handsaw here and cleaned it up the rest of the way. And now we're going to take it through the planer. Make sure that top is smoothed out, because the whole board itself was like a trapezoid, so it needed to be flattened pretty well. And some initial sanding just to get it sanded down and smoother, nicer to work with. And there was a lot of sanding involved in this project from start to finish, really. Actually, I feel like every project involves a lot of sanding, so it's kind of universal. And now we're getting it dusted off and getting it ready, because it's almost time to pour some epoxy. Now, at first, we've got to build the box. So here's what it looks like after some sanding. I think this was down to 120. There's no point in going any more than that at this stage. So 120 grit. And I had the box pieces cut out, and this is where I started drilling the holes and putting the screws in to get the box, make sure it was good to go. I just built it to the exact size of the shelf, and then pre-drilled the holes with countersink, with a countersink bit, so that the screws just, the heads don't stick out or anything. It's just nicer. Not really needed. I mean, it's just a form, but I use a countersink bit most of the time when I'm using screw or working with screws. And I've got my square clamps, which helped with this as well. Now I'm going to work on the bottom. I'm going to trim that down to length on the chop saw. And no point in ripping it down to length. It's not that much wider than the form, so I just leave it. It's like 3 inches wider, but like I said, I didn't feel the need to actually trim that plywood down. So here I'm just pre-drilling holes. Now these are just with the regular drill bit, no countersink bit, because I'm using flathead or panhead screws, so they will hold the bottom in better. Plus it's a 1/4 inch plywood, so like you do not want to countersink into that. It's not thick enough. There you go. We're almost ready for pouring, but there was one thing left to do, and that is we need to treat the inside of the form so that the epoxy doesn't just stick to the wood, which would be very bad. So what I'm going to do here is use some Tyvek tape, which I already have on hand from doing other work, so works out pretty well. And apply the Tyvek tape to the entire inside of the form where the epoxy is going to be. This stuff works really well on its own. Yeah, overall this project took, well, I started it 2 years ago, we'll just say that. So this whole scene that you're seeing here and all up that led up to this is about 2 years old. And it ended up sitting in the workshop for a couple years while I was doing other projects and just busy with life stuff. So, um, the good news is, yeah, the epoxy definitely had enough time to fully cure before I did anything else to it, because I got the pour done and everything back then, and so it literally had a year and a half just sitting in the workshop chilling, and so definitely cured, which is important. You want to make sure it's fully cured before you work with it. So here I'm applying silicone, some spray silicone to the Tyvek, and that just gives us an extra layer of um, protection, just to make absolutely sure it's not going to stick very well. The epoxy, it just helps it to release easier. And then we've got some latex caulk, silicone caulk, and that's just going to seal up the bottom. So I'll apply it to the bottom edge of the form and then just smear it, yeah. And that's it. That'll just make sure that the epoxy isn't going to start leaking out all over the table, which you really don't want for obvious reasons. And the screws are back in, and this is it. The form is now ready for pouring. And then so begins the epoxy stirring, which is now complete. And now we can start pouring. I'm going to start pouring in the voids because that's going to be obviously the lowest point. The large void on the right side of the board, there's actually a couple points that it goes all the way through the board. And so that void required a lot of epoxy to fill. So back to what I was saying before, you want to make sure the epoxy is completely cured before you start sanding it or running it through a planer or anything. Um, Otherwise, you're going to be causing a mess. So epoxy, if it's mixed correctly, should cure within a few days fully, but it also depends on like how thick it is and how deep it is. So it can take longer when you've got a thicker pour, especially for like the void areas where it's the board is about an inch thick, and then you've got another quarter inch of epoxy over that, so an inch and a quarter deep in some areas. So those areas would take longer to cure versus just a quarter inch on the top of the wood. But at any rate, we had plenty of time to cure. So here I'm just spreading it out with a silicone spatula, making sure it covers up or covers completely and somewhat evenly. It doesn't have to be perfectly even. Epoxy is pretty thick, and sometimes it'll have ridges or hills. Just depends on your type of epoxy as well. And then I'm using a heat gun to further spread it and make it even. And also it helps bring any bubbles to the surface and pop them. And this was a lot of time just working the bubbles and making sure that they were good. And then I've got some more epoxy that I mixed up and for additional pour here, and then we're just going to spread it again as the epoxy kind of soaks in to the void areas. Need some more epoxy, and then there's going to be one other pour that I do after this. And obviously you want to wear a respirator when doing this, especially indoors, which I don't think you would want to do epoxy work like this outdoors for fear of dust and debris. But yeah, respirator, very important. And then more bubble bursting, making sure those are coming to the surface and smoothing out the top and all that. And I think here we're gonna, yep, here's the last bit of the pour. So I did one final bit of epoxy mix up. I didn't want the top to be too deep. I was going for about an eighth of an inch really as far as the depth of the top. And so this worked out pretty well, the three pours. I don't remember how long this was in the workshop doing this whole epoxy section, but I'm fairly certain it was over an hour. It took quite a bit of time. Again, being 2 years ago, it's hard to remember. And we're good. So tuck it in, cover it up so no dust gets in there, and let it sit. And this is where I think this was probably a couple of days later. I don't remember, but it was probably, I know I gave it a few days before I uncovered it and took it out. And getting it out of the form was no problem at all. It was very easy. So here, this is just because of that caulk. And there's a couple spots that I just had to cut the caulk with the razor blade. And you see a little bit of epoxy seep through to the bottom, but not much. Not much at all, considering how much epoxy was on the top. And really, part of that is because of the voids, anyways. And then see here, it is not too difficult to get apart. And there's a couple spots that I just cut with the razor. And not too bad. Tyvek tape and spray silicone works out extremely well. And this is a point where 2 years later, I get back to it, or about a year and a half later, and we start sanding the bottom. So the bottom was not completely even, obviously, because of where the couple spots where the epoxy came through. So we're sanding that down just to get it mostly flat. This is a shelf. I mean, it doesn't need to be completely perfect. In fact, no project I work on is completely perfect and ever will be, I don't think. So we're just getting it down to where it's going to be mostly smooth and good enough to run through the planer. Because what we're going to want to do is once this side is smooth, we're going to use this side as the bottom to run through the planer and plane the top. Because the top was not completely perfectly flat. Like I said, with epoxy, it'll sometimes you can get it to be perfectly flat, but it's difficult. It's usually pretty thick, and especially this where I did 3 different pours. But yeah, we're just gonna run it through the planer and get the top completely flattened out. And as you see there, it one the side without the void was higher, and that's also attributed to just more of the epoxy settling into the wood on the void side. So that's probably the biggest reason, is because of just the void, and it absorbed more of the epoxy during the drying and curing process. So now we begin more sanding. We're using the Orbital sander just to get it flattened. If you try to do this by hand, it would take you forever, and it already involves a lot of time getting this down, even with the sander. So started with the sander. I think I started it with 120, and then I moved up to 220. And then here we're just going to go a little bit faster. And you can already see it's clearing up a little bit just with the 220 on the sander. And then now is where we start hand sanding it. So we're going to take it back down to 150, hand sanding it. And this involved a lot of manual hand sanding just to get it nice and smooth. And so we start with, I think it was 150 grit, and then 240, and then 320 is what I did for starters. And then here it starts to rain a little bit, sprinkle, which actually helps us in this situation, because we're actually about to start wet sanding anyways, and that's when we start with 400 grit. Yeah, actually, I had already started the wet sanding, wet sandpaper there. So we started with 400, and then moved up to 600. And here I'm pretty sure this is where we're at, 1,000 or so. It's I think I had, oh no, 800, 800, 1,200, 1,500. 1,500 is the highest grit that I have here. But if you want it to be a little bit more of a shiny finish, you can go up to 2,000 before you do the final wax at the end. But for me, I didn't really want like an ultra shiny shelf. And 1,500 is already pretty nice looking. Like, it's pretty clear by the time I get done with this. It's already. And putting the wax on, it just clears it up a little bit more. But the wax is coming a little bit later. So making sure we do all the edges. Obviously, the back side of the shelf, I'm not gonna bother with. I got that down to, I think, 220 or 240. But seeing as how it's gonna be against the wall, I didn't really care to get it nice, obviously. And then now that we're done with all the sanding, we're gonna clean it up with some alcohol. I think this is 90%. just clean out any of the remaining residual dust, epoxy dust, and that's in there. And this is where it starts to really, I mean, it's already looking good, but it really starts to look good at this stage. And of course, we're gonna clean the bottom and everywhere. Really, we want to make sure that all that, or at least most of that dust is gone. Because what I'm gonna use for this is linseed oil. And here, so for the supports, I actually had these cut off pieces from that Lazy Susan build. So these I saved and threw them in the corner of the shop, and just for such an occasion, wasn't even planning. In fact, at that time when I built the Lazy Susan, I don't think I was even planning to use these for it, but I saw them over there, and I was like, well, I mean, this kind of actually works perfectly, and so yeah, and they're not square because I mean it was a cutout, and so I never had a reason to like make the board square when I was making the Lazy Susan, since it was a circle cutout. So these weren't square, in which we needed to fix to be used for a shelf. So we just do that real easily on the chop saw. And now it's perfectly square. Make sure the other one's good. And then we're just going to cut the ends down to the length. I measured those and marked them and then cut them to length. And now one of them was a little bit bigger than the other one. And so I'm just going to trace it. And we're going to clean that up on the bandsaw or get it close. So I trace it and then I cut, making sure not to cut on the line and a little bit outside of the line. I mean, worst comes to worst, it wouldn't really matter because what I'm doing is I'm going to tape these together, and now I'm going to take it onto the spindle sander, and then both, that way once I get this done, both will be exactly the same. And of course this will smooth it out and make it ready for finish, or close to ready for finish. I'm still going to do a bunch of hand sanding. This spindle sander right now has 120 grit paper on it, and I want to bring this down to 320 grit because the finish I'm using is going to be linseed oil, and so doing linseed oil uh, is just going to be nicer with a higher grit finish, like a 320 grit. So we're just kind of shaping it the way I want it and making sure it's all nice and smooth. And now we're going to clean off the spindle sander because, you know, next time I go to use it, it'll be ready to go instead of me having to clean it. And so coming up now, we're just going to use the router with an 1/8 inch round over bit, and I do a test cut on this piece first, make sure we're good, and now we're going to round over my arches for the shelf support. You know, so router makes quick work of that. And then it's back to more sanding. Nice, nice and round. And I've just got my vacuum hose here turned on, and it just helps keep the dust down. And as the dust builds up on the sanding block, just easy to have the vacuum cleaner there, um, just to keep it clean. What I used to do was just have a brush beside me, and I would just brush it every few minutes. But I mean, that just gets super fine dust everywhere. And I do have an air filter, but I mean, this just kind of saves your air filter, and it's just nicer to have less dust overall floating around the shop. Like, so anytime you can reduce the dust in your shop, it's just a good idea, in my opinion. I mean, do what you want in your shop, but for me, the less dust, the better. And now we're going to do some more hand sanding with my sanding blocks. Again, we're going down to 320 grit. So I'm using the sanding block for the flat sides, and then I'll use the freestanding paper just for all the edges and corners. And some more alcohol. It's important to get as much of that dust out as you can. And now we've got some epoxy. This is a quick set epoxy that we're going to use, and it's actually a year old. I had it open, used it for a different project, but there was just enough left to use for this, so it worked out perfectly. So we're just going to apply that to each shelf support, and that's all we're going to need. Like, we don't need any other form of attachment. And then I'm using a square to make sure it's square and straight, and then I'm using a clamp temporarily just to kind of help um, move it into place. It needed to be moved or squished down a little bit. That one, and there you go. That's it for those. And once they were dry, I mean, it's 5 minute set epoxy, but I gave it an hour. This might have even been the next day. I don't remember, but it set up quick. Like, even by the time I was in that video or in that clip, it was already like dry enough to where they weren't moving. And then now we've got linseed oil mixed with mineral spirits that we're applying to the bottom and to the shelf supports. And we're just going to keep applying until it stops absorbing, or at least slows down significantly on absorbing, just to get enough in there. The mineral spirits will evaporate and leave behind the oil, and what it does, it thins it out to where it can get deeper into the wood. And so this, I didn't record all of this, but there were several like reapplications of this that I did over the course of a couple hours. And once that was dry, um, I wiped, or once that was mostly absorbed, you kind of wipe it off, any residual, and then you're either good to go, or you can add paste wax to kind of finalize the finish, which I love using paste wax on top of it. It just gives you one extra layer of protection, and also it does seem to smooth it out a little bit better. It fills up any kind of super tiny scratches and stuff, and fills them in and makes it just slightly shinier, nicer finish. And by scratches, I mean from sanding, because sanding is essentially scratching the wood. Um, and now we're starting the top of the shelf with the paste wax, because it doesn't need You don't use oil or anything on this. It's just getting paste wax. And there are a few defects on the bottom of the top that I could. They were slightly low spots in the epoxy, and I did not want to completely remove those with the planer because it just would have removed a little bit too much of the epoxy. It would have started removing to the point where some spots of the wood would have shown through, and I just didn't want that to happen. So instead, we just left those couple areas how they are, and is what it is. It's not a perfect project, and I am still extremely happy with how this turned out. It looks fantastic. It looks to me, it just looks amazing. So to me, I mean, every project you have will have defects, and this is for me. This is not something I made for somebody else, and so I'm perfectly happy with how it turned out. Like I said, and this is a close up after the wax. So I mean, to me, sanding it down to 1500, this is the perfect finish, the perfect shine that I wanted for my shelf. Um, but you can, again, you can go higher grit if you want a more glossy finish than this. And now we're just attaching the um, shelf holders using a little tiny drill bit to pre-drill the holes because you absolutely need to do that. And then just making sure they're tight, but they don't have to be ultra tight. And now we're just going to add some weather stripping to the bottom of the support shelves, or support shelf, shelf supports. Ugh. Um, and so what this will do is it'll just make this shelf, the bottom of it, stand out from the wall to where it's a flat top and not like leaning forward. And then this is just showing all the sandpaper that was used for, and then the final paste wax for finish. It just looks beautiful. I love the colors and everything, and that void just it looks really awesome. And here it is finished on the wall with my wolf pack that I cut out on the um, whatchamacallit saw. I can't even think of the name right now. Scroll saw. There we go. All right, well, that's it. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you on the next video. Take care.